Everyone, welcome to the last part of chapter 3. So we're wrapping up this chapter on all of the human processes to set that foundation for all the regions we're going to talk about this semester. And so in this part of the chapter, we're going to finish up our discussion of demographics with discussions of urbanization and migration. And lastly, we're going to talk about political systems. So urbanization is the percent of a population living in cities. And globally speaking, a couple of years ago, we passed the 50% mark. So we now have more people on this planet living in urban areas than we do in rural areas. Traditionally, less developed countries are less urban and more developed countries are more urban. So we look at a place like the Netherlands, whose urbanization rate is well over 90%. And China, where it's at about 56%. Developing countries urbanize really rapidly, especially in stage 3 of that demographic transition model that we talked about. And that's because they are industrializing and they need workers. We need people to work in those factories, and a lot of people are moving to those cities in order to get those jobs. And so you have this huge rural to urban migration that's happening. This is happening a lot in many parts of Asia. It's also happening a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. Some of the growth in sub-Saharan African cities, the footprint of that city is just growing so incredibly rapidly. And one of the reasons that people move to cities as well is that cities tend to provide better lives, right? And give you a smaller ecological footprint per capita. If we're in a city, we are going to use less resources than if we are living in a suburb. We're also going to have more access to education and more access to healthcare and good infrastructure. But again, cities can grow very fast in stage 3. Here's a city in China that pretty much kind of sprouted up almost overnight. So some of these places that are in these special economic zones, where you have factories that are making things like our iPhones, you have cities just almost popping up overnight. Next, we're going to talk about migration. And this exists both within countries and between countries. There are a couple distinct streams of migration. The first is that rural to urban migration that I was talking about in the previous slide. So people leaving that countryside, moving to the city mostly for economic opportunity. And the next is from less developed to more developed countries. So we can see here on the top, here's a picture in San Diego of an Ethiopian restaurant that's in City Heights called Red Sea, which has amazing food, and you should all go there and next time you're in San Diego and have some good food. But in San Diego, there is lots and lots of different ethnic populations that have substantial sizes to them: Ethiopian, Eritrean, Vietnamese, Chaldean. And so you have a lot of people just migrating for that economic opportunity from a less developed to a more developed country. And also we have from that colony to colonizer. In the first part, we talked about colonialism and that relationship between those countries that still exist. So here's a picture of London, lots of Indian food, lots of people living in those places who England used to rule over. And the reason that people migrate is for a variety of push and pull factors. And so it's how people decide to migrate. If people are compelled to leave, right, they are pushed out for a certain reason. And that could be war, famine, disease, repression, lack of economic opportunity is obviously a big one. They are drawn elsewhere. They are pulled to that place, usually for things like jobs, education, and freedom. And often it's a mix of these, right? It's not that you just have a push or you just have a pull, right? Usually there's something pushing you out of the place you're migrating from and then pulling you to this other place. I also want to take a moment for us to understand the important, very important distinction between immigrant and refugee. My grandparents on my mother's side came over through Ellis Island from Czechoslovakia during a period of open immigration in the United States, looking for a better life, settled in. This is very different from a refugee, such as those who are fleeing Syria right now, who are basically leaving their homes to live, right, to survive. So they're not just like, oh, I really want to go and have a better economic opportunity. They are, my country is being blown up. I'm concerned that I am about to die, so I need to go to another country in order to survive. Your exercise for this module is going to be looking at this interactive animated migration map, which is one of my favorite maps. And so there'll be a link to it in the exercise. But basically, you can click on different countries. Countries that have blue dots have more people going in them than going out of them. Countries that have red dots have more people leaving them. This is just a snapshot of it, but this big red dot right here, this is Syria. So what you're going to do for this exercise is you're going to look at a bunch of different places and you're going to tell me why you think that those migration streams exist. The last thing we're going to talk about in chapter 3 is a little bit about political geography. And so I'm going to start with just some terminology so that you understand the difference between a country, a nation, and a state. So this is going to get a little listy for a second, and excuse me, I apologize. Nations are groups of people with a common cultural heritage, like an ethnic group, right? So a nation is not necessarily a political unit, right? It's just a group of people with a common cultural heritage. So if we want to think about this in the United States, we could think about the Navajo Nation, right? That is a group of people with a common cultural heritage. States are what we tend to think of as countries. They are political entities with defined territories. They may contain multiple nations. So there's a picture there of the flags outside of the United Nations, which should have been called the United States, but that name was already taken. Nation states are countries that are home to a dominant nation. So true or close to true nation states that are mostly homogenous are super rare, and they mostly exist in Asia, places like Japan and North and South Korea. Stateless nations are cultural groups with no governed territory. And so for the example could be the Kurds. They are split between Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. They are often the persecuted minority in those countries. There is no independent Kurdistan, but many Kurds certainly want an independent Kurdistan where they could control their own political systems. A lot of this, not all, but a lot of this, especially in Africa, are vestiges of colonialism, of people coming in from outside in Europe and just drawing borders with no regard to who lived there or what their ethnicity was. And now you have large groups that cross borders and become minorities in multiple places. So I want to talk a little bit about governance systems, and we have two main types of governance systems, and I'm not talking about socialist versus democratic, but we have inclusive governments where you have economic and political freedom generally, and that government is existing to serve the citizens. There's an inclusion of individuals, encourages investment, innovation, and growth. And so we can look at the top there in the United States, there's a polling place where you can go to vote and you can do it in multiple languages, right? In the United States, we have no official language. Many people think it's English. It's not. You can go to the DMV and take your driver's test in about 20 different languages. So this type of inclusive government is typical in the developed world and in most settler colonies. So not those mercantile colonies, but the places where Europeans went in and settled, like the United States, like South Africa, although South Africa a little bit less these days. Extractive governments are ones where the economic and political repression and rampant corruption, that government is existing to serve those in power, right? Not serve the people. Wealth is extracted for their benefits. It is exclusionary. It hinders participation, innovation, and growth. And this is prevalent in mercantile colonies before, during, and after colonization. And so one of the things that's happening in the US right now is that people are worried that our government is becoming more extractive and less inclusive, especially with terms of trying to restrict ways in which people can vote or exercise free speech. And so we're going to talk a little bit about an example of an extractive government, Robert Mugabe, who's the president of Zimbabwe, who you could see there. So some of the absurd tales from Robert Mugabe's rule in Zimbabwe. He has been in power since 1980. He has a net worth of several $billions, while the average citizen earns about $500 a year. He has an open admiration for Hitler. His political opponents keep getting into random head-on collisions and dying. He won the lottery. He actually played the lottery and said that he won it, and so he got to collect all of that money. And when he tripped and fell, he tried to suppress the publication of pictures of him tripping and falling. He is a great enemy of the free press, and there's the picture of him tripping and falling, which I like to spread around, show your friends, because screw that guy. And so my last slide for chapter 3 is this really interesting paper that came out a little while ago that looks at the decade you were born and the percentage of people who say that it is essential to live in a democracy. And a democracy is an inclusive government. There are plenty of extractive governments that say that they are democracies, but they're really not, because they don't really have open and fair elections. And so generally speaking, people who were born in the 30s and the 40s think that it is very essential to live in a democracy. And people who are born in the 80s think it's much less important to live in a democracy. And so if you look at the United States here, people born in 1930, 75% of them said it's essential to live in a democracy, as opposed to around 30% of those who are born in the 80s, which is a very startling trend. And we are going to see moving forward in this class about how essential it can be to live in a democracy, in a free and open society, and all of the benefits that come with that. So now you're going to proceed on to that exercise about migration. You're going to take your first map quiz of the semester and then the country journal entry for this week.